Russia is getting desperate. As long-range Ukrainian drone strikes have become a weekly occurrence, Vladimir Putin has to face the fact that Russia's air defenses aren't working. Russia pretends that they are. The drone debris excuse used every time Ukraine scores a direct hit on a target inside Russia is proof of that. But the reality is far different. Russia is desperate. So desperate that Putin is begging Turkey for help because Ukraine has crushed his air defenses. The big question now is, will Turkey answer Putin's call? On September 13th, Defense Express reported that Russia has put out feelers for a potential buyback of the S-400 surface-to-air missile defense systems that it sold to Turkey. The outlet says that a shortage of these air defense systems, which are among the most advanced Russia is capable of fielding, is one of Putin's biggest problems when dealing with Ukraine's long-range strikes. To Russia, the buyback makes sense. Turkey isn't using the S-400s it's bought from Russia, as we'll explain later in the video. And the missiles Russia initially provided are soon going to require Russian maintenance anyway. So Putin is offering a deal to Turkey. Sell your S-400s back to Russia and put the money towards something that you will actually use. If Turkey says yes to the offer, then we already know what Russia will be receiving. Russia sold 4 of its S-400s to Turkey back in 2017 at a total cost of $2.5 billion. That amounts to about $625 million per unit, which is a pretty large outlay for a single weapon. What isn't known is what Russia is offering for these systems. A like-for-like buyback would probably be Turkey's preference, as it doesn't want to lose out on the initial $2.5 billion it spent. However, Russia may try to make the case that Turkey isn't using these weapons, so it's better to claw some money back rather than letting the weapons rot in a storage facility. Russia's offer is on the table, even if we don't know the particulars. The big question is simple: will Turkey say yes? As obvious a question as this is to ask, the answer isn't simple in the slightest. Turkey has long walked a tightrope between Russia and the West. On one hand, the country is a NATO member, as well as a country that has applied for European Union or EU membership. That EU application has been on hold for years, with the EU having voted in May to keep Turkey's accession process frozen amidst concerns about the country's lack of true democracy. That vote passed with 367 in favor of freezing, 74 against, and 188 abstentions. Still, these memberships and desired memberships show that Turkey absolutely wants to build stronger ties with the West. On the other hand, Turkey hasn't exactly cut Russia off as a result of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. It's still buying more Russian oil than any EU member, for instance, and the very fact that Turkey bought S-400s in the first place shows that the country is far from fully aligned with the Western nations that have been more forthright in their condemnations and crackdowns on Russia for the Ukraine invasion. All of this leads to the interesting situation where there is a case for and a case against agreeing to sell Turkey's S-400s back to Russia, at least from the Turkish perspective. We'll start with the case for. As mentioned, Turkey's initial purchase of Russian S-400s was controversial when it was made. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, dug into the issue in a 2019 article, just days after Turkey received the first elements of the S-400s it had purchased 2 years before. Turkey's purchase led to the US threatening to impose both military and economic sanctions on the country, as the move was seen as something of a betrayal of Turkey's NATO membership. After all, though it may not have been outright stated at the time, Russia was NATO's enemy then, as it is now. By purchasing Russian air defense systems, the US argued, Turkey was showing favoritism to that enemy rather than integrating its air defenses with NATO. It's telling that Turkey also considered, though eventually refused, several Western air defense systems before buying the S-400s. CSIS says that the US-made Patriot and French SAMP-T were on Turkey's radar before being rejected. Presumably, Turkey felt that it was getting a better deal with the S-400, whether it thought that in terms of legitimately believing that Russia's air defense system was better than the other options, or that by making the purchase, Turkey could build stronger ties with the Russian Federation, doesn't matter. What does matter is that Turkey went through with the purchase. And true to its word, the US, under President Donald Trump during his first term, followed through on its sanctions threat. Those sanctions involved the US cutting Turkey out of the F-35 program, even though Turkey offered financial and manufacturing expertise to get that program off the ground. At the time, CSIS suggested that Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan may have been willing to accept the sanctions. But if Erdogan's S-400 decision is driven by fundamental desire to preserve his rule, as a matter, he says, of national sovereignty, then both the loss of the F-35 and CAATSA sanctions may be a price he's willing to pay, CSIS said in 2019. For Turkey, then, the S-400 purchase was a way for Erdogan to put a stamp on his rule, moving the country away from the West through the purchase of systems that NATO would never integrate into its air defenses. However, this desire for national sovereignty created a problem. Earlier we mentioned that Turkey has yet to deploy any of the S-400s it purchased from Russia. The issue, as United 24 Media notes, is that the Russian system isn't compatible with the primarily NATO-aligned defenses present in Turkey. So Turkey might see the sale of its S-400s back to Russia as a way to make some money back from a purchase that ended up being a bust. In the process, Turkey might also hope that getting rid of its S-400s would lead to the US lifting its sanctions, especially the one that prevents Turkey from buying more F-35s. We'll come back to that point later in the video. For now, we can say that Turkey's initial purchase of Russia's S-400 demonstrated its desire to maintain some semblance of a relationship with Putin. Selling S-400s back to Russia on Putin's request might allow Turkey to keep that relationship going while also strengthening its position among its NATO allies. However, Turkey's desire to maintain a relationship with Russia leads us to another reason why the country might consider Putin's S-400 offer. Turkey buys a lot of Russian oil. Some might say too much Russian oil. The Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, or CREA, highlights the scale of the problem in 2024. During the first half of that year, CREA says Turkey rose from being Russia's 14th largest crude oil customer before Putin kicked off his Ukraine invasion to being Russia's third best customer. While other European nations turning away from Russian oil may have played a role in that fast rise, that doesn't change the fact that Turkey, as a NATO member, is pouring money into Russia's war chest in return for oil. Worse yet, Turkey is complicit in making sure that Russia's oil ends up being imported by G7 countries, CREA says. In the same period, CREA says when referring to the first half of 2024, 3 Turkish refineries have used 1.2 billion euros worth of Russian crude to create oil products that are then being imported by G7+ countries. 1.2 billion euros amounts to about $1.4 billion, with the issue showcasing how Turkey has turned itself into an intermediary for Russian oil. The relationship is simple. Turkey buys Russian crude oil, often at a cut price due to Western sanctions against Russia's oil industry. Then Turkey uses its refineries to turn that crude oil into usable products such as gasoline and diesel, that Turkey then sells on to G7 countries. The nations that may not be willing to buy oil from Russia directly still end up contributing to Putin's oil-based cash flow thanks to Turkey handling the refining on Russia's behalf. At least that's what the relationship seems to be. Politico also reported on this awkward situation, noting that the oil ties between Turkey, Russia, and the European nations to which Turkey sells its refined products are possible because of an oversight in Western sanctions. And it's all legal, Politico declares. The scheme is possible because of a workaround in Brussels sanctions that allows blended fuels into the EU if they're labeled as non-Russian. It's a lucrative loophole, with the research showing that it generated up to 3 billion euros for Moscow from 3 ports alone in the 12 months after the EU banned Russia's fuels in February 2023. Turkey is showing no sign of slowing down with its Russian oil purchases either. In July, Energy Intelligence reported that Turkey is actually going in the opposite direction. It's ramping up. The previous month saw Turkey's purchases of Russian crude rise to 300,000 barrels per day, most of which was Urals blended crude. Turkey imported more Russian crude with those 300,000 barrels per day than it had in over a year, Energy Intelligence reported. We're not telling you all of this to highlight Europe's collective hypocrisy when buying Turkish oil products despite knowing that they're made with Russian oil. That hypocrisy exists, there's no denying that fact. However, the important point to make here is that Turkey is still buying Russian crude at a time when practically all of its NATO and potential future EU allies have pulled away, or at least are in the process of pulling away. Again, it's an example of Turkey trying to play both sides. And that brings us back to Putin's S-400 proposal. Turkey may see an opportunity in this proposal. For instance, it could tell Russia that in addition to whatever cash Putin pays directly for the S-400s, Turkey also wants Russia to give it a discount on the oil it's buying. Alternatively, Turkey may use the fact that it's now one of Russia's most important oil customers for leverage, allowing it to command a higher price for the S-400s that it isn't using. Either way, Turkey comes out as a winner while still being able to maintain the relationship with Russia that it's worked so hard to foster, even as the Ukraine war rages. However, the fact that the war is ongoing and that Putin's request to buy Turkey's S-400s is clearly related to that war brings us to the case against Turkey agreeing to sell. Because although selling its S-400s back to Russia could earn Turkey a pretty penny while strengthening its relationship with Russia, Turkey might end up having to navigate a geopolitical storm if that sale goes through. First, we mentioned earlier that Turkey may see selling its S-400s as a way to get back in the US's good graces. That would be the case if the customer for those defense systems was anybody other than the nation that sold them to Turkey in the first place. Turkey instead finds itself in a difficult position, whereby the S-400s that caused so many problems when they were first purchased could create an equally powerful political backlash if they're sold back to Russia. After all, Turkey would be strengthening Russia by selling those systems. That's the last thing that the West wants to see. As United 24 Media aptly puts it, selling the weapons back to Russia could bring political backlash from Washington and potentially derail Turkey's stated ambition to return to the F-35 program and acquire 32 new F-16C Block 70 fighters. Breaking Defense adds that Turkey has been making some headway in overcoming the F-35 ban slapped on it by the US in the wake of the S-400 purchases. It's been building its own air defenses, dubbed the Steel Dome. that are multi-layered and will feature the Hisar and Sipa air defense systems that Turkey could potentially make available to NATO. That move away from the S-400 has made Turkey's re-inclusion into the F-35 program a possibility, with Breaking Defense adding that it would benefit NATO to sell these fifth-generation fighters to Turkey. The country occupies an important geopolitical space thanks to its proximity to Russia, meaning F-35s in Turkey lead to a greater NATO threat posed to Russia. However, this is where things get dicey for Turkey. Getting rid of its S-400s is a good thing for Turkey, at least when it comes to the NATO relationship. But getting rid of those systems by selling them back to Russia just creates another geopolitical problem. To avoid that problem, Turkey would have to say no to Putin. That means it will be stuck with the S-400s that caused so many issues in the first place. That is unless Turkey comes up with an alternative. We'll explore what that alternative might be soon. Second on the list for the case against Turkey saying yes to Putin's request is that Turkey, at least outwardly, is more a supporter of Ukraine in its war against Russia than it is of Putin. Again, Turkey has been playing both sides somewhat, as we've seen with its Russian oil purchases. However, it's also supplied Ukraine with enough weapons to draw Putin's ire. As the Atlantic Council noted in 2024, the partnership between Ukraine and Turkey has resulted in the former receiving plenty of Bayraktar drones, which achieved legendary status during the first year of the war. Erdogan even allows Ukraine to manufacture this Turkish drone and doesn't appear to have made a similar deal with Russia, which will stick in Putin's craw. Ukraine has also received Cobra II tactical vehicles, which are made in Turkey. Plus, Turkey is in the process of building a pair of Ada-class anti-submarine corvettes that will be added to Ukraine's navy, the Atlantic Council reports. All of these factors point to a nation that supports Ukraine militarily, even as it fills Russia's coffers with oil-related cash. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov certainly made the Kremlin's anger over the situation known in November 2024, according to Euronews. Turkish weapons are used by the Ukrainian armed forces to kill Russian military personnel and civilians. This situation cannot but cause surprise, given the Turkish government's statements that it's ready to provide mediation, Lavrov said. Lavrov is referring to Turkey's repeated offer to act as a mediator in peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. It also highlights once again that Turkey is attempting to balance on a very delicate tightrope. The country has also offered to send troops into Ukraine if they're needed, Reuters reported in March. Turkey maintains NATO's second-largest army after the US, the outlet notes, and it seems happy to position itself as a country that will help to keep the peace should peace be negotiated. This association with Ukraine suggests that selling Russia's S-400s back to Putin would be a bad idea for Turkey. While Turkey's oil purchases aren't being overlooked, they're not directly related to strengthening Russia's military. Selling air defense systems that everybody knows Putin will use to try to mitigate the impact of Ukraine's long-range drone and missile strikes would contribute direct military help, at least in some Western eyes. It's far easier for Turkey to say no to Putin if it wants to maintain its desired position as a mediator that is more than willing to deal with Ukraine's military than Russia's army. Feeding into that pro-Ukraine argument is the situation in the Black Sea. It would be inaccurate to say that Turkey's decision to block military vessels from entering the Black Sea is solely an action that affects Russia. Turkey, which controls the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits that feed into the Black Sea, has blocked access to all military ships. As if to prove that point, the UK Defence Journal noted in January 2024 that Turkey had blocked the passage of a pair of former Royal Navy ships intended for Ukraine. So Turkey is an equal opportunities blockader when it comes to the Black Sea. Still, there's no denying that Russia is hurt more by the Black Sea blockade than Ukraine, and Turkey will know that. Russia has lost a third of its Black Sea fleet that most thought would terrorize Ukraine when Putin launched his invasion. Russia has literally hundreds of other ships it could send into the Black Sea to replenish that fleet, but it can't do it because Turkey won't allow the transit of military vessels. Turkey is clearly using its control over the two key straits for its own tactical benefit in the Black Sea. Turkey also maintains the largest Black Sea navy out of any country with access to the sea, War on the Rocks points out. All of this means that weakening Russia is in Turkey's best interests, as demonstrated by Turkey itself. Selling S-400s back to Russia runs counter to that desire to weaken the country. Perhaps that more than Turkey's partnerships with Ukraine and its desire to get in good with the F-35 program again will be reason enough for Turkey to say no to Putin's offer. Still, refusing to sell to Putin doesn't solve the issue of Turkey having S-400s in the first place. The US, at least, takes issue with that fact, even if Turkey hasn't deployed the Russian air defense system. But with the idea of selling its S-400s now being considered, Turkey could end up taking another option, an option that we hinted at earlier in the video. Turkey could say no to Putin and yes to Ukraine. If Turkey is going to sell its S-400s to anybody, it could sell them to Ukraine and still manage to maintain the balance it's looking to strike between Russia and the West. Of course, Putin will be angry about that choice. A lot of complaining would come out of the Kremlin, possibly alongside threats. However, Turkey's oil leverage we mentioned earlier could also come into play here. With Turkey now such a major Russian oil customer at a time when Russia needs as much money flowing in as possible, Would Putin be willing to sacrifice that relationship over the sale of S-400s to Ukraine? Perhaps, or perhaps not. If Turkey is feeling brave, it might take that risk. Better yet for Turkey, selling its S-400s to Ukraine would achieve the dual goals of getting rid of the Russian air defense system for good and further ingratiating Turkey into the West by offering very direct support for Ukraine. After all, Ukraine is aching for more air defense systems, and it's not like Russian air defense systems would be unfamiliar, given that much of Ukraine's military before Putin's invasion was based on Soviet-era technology. The odds are that Ukraine could figure out how to use Turkey's S-400s to its advantage, even if the systems aren't immediately compatible with what it's already using. There's just one problem. Turkey has said no to this idea in the past. TVP World reports that 2023 saw the US ask Turkey's then Foreign Minister, Mevlut Cavusoglu, whether Turkey would sell its S-400s to Ukraine. At the time, the answer was a resounding no. Turkey was likely too worried about damaging its relationship with Russia to consider the possibility at the time. But now it faces the same issue if it sells those systems back to Putin. Perhaps 2 years after its initial refusal, Turkey will be more open to selling its S-400s to the very country against which Putin wants to use them. Putin may have just opened a can of worms that he should have kept shut. We can only wait and see what Turkey decides to do. In the meantime, it's clear that Russia is getting more desperate by the day, which is why it's trying to buy back the air defense systems it sold in the first place. That desperation is also seen on the battlefield, as Putin has demanded that Russia's military cooks be sent to the front lines. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering the latest developments in the Ukraine war. And thank you for watching.